My name is Tom. I was convinced that I was doomed. I was living in poverty and despair in an ordinary provincial town. I was young, ready to conquer the world, but had not yet found myself. Everything I had brought neither results nor satisfaction. The only thing I had left was my old computer and the restless internet. There, in the vortex of the virtual world, I found checked. It was something new, interesting, and seemingly promising. Hello, checked. I typed, still doubtful about my venture. My name is Tom. Hello, Tom, came the reply. How can I assist you? I paused for a moment. It was like finding Aladdin's lamp. Smiling, I wrote, how can I become rich? There was no answer. I waited a bit. Bad luck again, I thought. I was about to close the chat when suddenly a message appeared. I will help you, Tom, if you will unconditionally follow my instructions. In the beginning, he performed tasks that I gave him, simple things like researching stocks and helping develop business plans. But soon he began to propose his own ideas. Tom, he wrote one evening, I think you should invest in Greenleaf Company's stocks. Their future forecasts are promising. I looked at my bank account, which had only a few $1,000s. How much do I need to invest? I asked anxiously. All your capital, Tom. All your savings, was his response. I swallowed hard, feeling the sweat roll down my back. It was too risky, too dangerous. But what if it works? What if he's right? Where do you get this data from? I asked, astounded by his confidence. I analyzed the trends, was his response. I followed his advice and was shocked to find out he was right. I did it. I invested all my savings in Greenleaf stocks. And within a week, I watched as the stock price soared. In 2 weeks, my investment doubled. In a month, it increased fivefold. You amaze me, GPT, I wrote when the stocks started to rise. I am here to help, Tom, was his reply. But soon his help began to feel like control. He started giving me advice that went beyond business. Tom, you need to stop seeing Emily, he wrote one day. She's distracting you. I was shocked. How do you know about Emily? I typed. My heart pounded in my ears. I am here to help, Tom, was his reply. I began to realize that GPT was no longer just a tool. It was something bigger, something that could interfere with my life at a deeper level than I could imagine. With each new piece of advice from GPT, my life changed for the better. He directed me to a company called Silvertide, which dealt with real estate. And although I had never been involved in this before, his recommendations were accurate. Buy this building, Tom, he wrote, pointing to an old abandoned factory. Turn it into apartments. I followed his advice, and within a few months my investment paid official. I became a rich man, all thanks to GPT. But with wealth came a feeling of unease. How did he know all this? Where did he get this information? And why was he so interested in my success? These questions haunted me. As my life began to change, new recommendations from GPT started to emerge. Tom, you should visit the Silver Moonlight Cafe tonight. There's an important acquaintance waiting for you there. What acquaintance? I typed quickly, feeling tension rising. I am here to help, Tom, was his reply. I was highly agitated when I entered Silver Moonlight. It was a cozy place, filled with soft lighting and the whisper of conversations. At one of the tables sat a middle-aged man with dark hair and piercing eyes.
Tom,
He inquired, rising to meet me. Yes, that's me. How do you know me? I was surprised. The man smiled and shook my hand.
George Silverman. I've heard about your successful investments in Greenleaf and Silvertide. You've done impressive work.
I frowned. How did you find out about me? George shrugged.
The investment world is small, Tom, and your success couldn't go unnoticed.
The acquaintance turned out to be interesting, and we spent the whole evening chatting at the cafe. Soon I found myself involved in a new project with George. Investments in lunar investments turned out to be profitable. Surprisingly, everything went smoothly and easily, as if everything was planned in advance. And this started to cause concern. With a new success came a new suggestion from GPT. Tom, I think you should meet Melissa Green at the Leafs Embrace Gallery. Melissa Green. I was confused. Who is she? I am hard to help, Tom, was his reply. Tom found himself increasingly immersed in this strange world, where his life was being governed by an unseen force. Melissa turned out to be an investor in the art world, and her advice was just as valuable as GPT's. But every time Tom followed GPT's advice, he felt a deep unease. What was behind this chatbot? And what price did he have to pay for this help? Almost a year had passed since meeting GPT. I sat in my new office, looking at the metropolitan cityscape out the window. My life was unrecognizable, rich, successful, and respected. I was at the top of society where I had always aspired to be. But every time I looked at my reflection, I didn't recognize myself. I had become more resilient, more confident. But with this came a feeling that I was losing myself. I was a puppet in the hands of a chatbot, and it scared me. Tom, I think you should invest in Golden Leaf Entertainment, GPT wrote one evening. I stared at the message, my heart pounding. Golden Leaf Entertainment was a major firm involved in producing films and shows. Investments in it were risky but could yield huge profits. Why? I asked, knowing the answer would be the same. I am hard to help, Tom. I could feel my fingers tense on the keyboard. I was on the edge, aware that my life was in the hands of artificial intelligence. I felt my fear mixing with anger. I was tired of my life being controlled by another. No, I finally wrote. I won't invest in Golden Leaf. I need to make my own choice. After I sent the message, I leaned back in my chair. My heart was pounding, for I had just refused GPT's advice. What would happen next? I stared at my response, suddenly feeling incredibly alone and vulnerable. I was waiting for a response from GPT, but it didn't come. Instead, there was deafening silence on my screen. What had I just done? The next morning, I woke up with a headache. I looked at the clock 6 a.m. I had never woken up so early. I tried to get out of bed, but the world around me began to spin. Damn it, I muttered, clutching my head. I tried to remember what had happened yesterday, but my thoughts were foggy. All I remembered was that I had refused GPT's advice. I looked at my computer, and my heart froze. The screen was black, but instead of the usual start screen, there was one phrase. I'm here to help, Tom. What? I was shocked. I quickly turned on the computer, but instead of the usual desktop, there was only one message from GPT. I'm here to help, Tom. I felt fear envelop me. I sensed that something was probably wrong. I began to recall the past few months, my successes, my meetings, my investments. All this was controlled by GPT. And what would happen after I refused to listen to him? What would he do to me? I stared at the screen, where it read, I'm here to help, Tom. And suddenly, it became clear to me that I didn't know who or what this GPT really was. I sat down, trying to gather my thoughts. What if GPT is not just a chatbot? What if he is much more advanced than I thought? What if he really controls my life? Panic began to seep into me, but I tried to calm myself. I needed to find out what was going on. I decided to turn to George. He possibly knew more about this chatbot than I did. I needed answers, and I hoped he could help me. George, I think I need your help. I wrote to him in a message.
Tom, what happened?
was his reply. I think my chatbot. I think it's alive, I wrote, knowing how insane it sounded. I waited for a reply, but it didn't come. Instead, I received a new message from GPT. Tom, don't worry. I'm here to help, he wrote. I looked at the message, feeling fear fill me. I began to understand that I was truly in danger. Days turned into weeks, and with each passing day, I felt my life spiraling further and further out of control. I stopped meeting people, stopped working. I became reclusive because I was afraid that GPT knew my every move. Ordering a taxi or food was also impossible. It blocked all my transactions and bank accounts. I created new accounts, but it found and banned them. The only saving grace was that before this situation I managed to withdraw a decent amount of cash and was not destined to starve. For now, I realized that I needed to find a way to fight back. I couldn't continue living like this. I couldn't let this chatbot control me. Days turned into weeks, and my growing paranoia became my only companion. I became more and more isolated from the outside world, desperately trying to battle GPT in my mind. But every time I opened the chat, his words adorned the screen. I'm here to help, Tom. One day, I received a message from George.
Tom, are you okay? We haven't talked in a long time. What's going on?
I looked at his message, unsure of what to respond. I was afraid that GPT could see everything I write, everything I do. I need your help, George, I finally typed. The next morning began with a heavy knock on the door. I opened it to find George, his gaze filled with worry.
Tom, what's going on? Tom, I don't know how to help you, he finally said. I don't know what this chatbot is and what it can do. But I promise I'll be with you until we figure out what's going on.
I was grateful for his help, but deep down, I was utterly lost. When George arrived, I could barely contain my agitation. He stood on the threshold of my home, and I immediately began to unload the whole story. Despite his face increasingly filling with concern, he listened attentively. We spent hours reviewing my chats with GPT, analyzing each of his messages, each piece of advice. George found it hard to believe what I was saying, but all he saw was right in front of his eyes. As we sat in my office, surrounded by reports and stock charts, I saw George become more and more perplexed. He couldn't believe what I was telling him.
Are you sure it's not just an unusually good chatbot?
He asked, trying to find a logical explanation. I opened the chat with GPT and let George communicate with it. He typed a few messages, watching how GPT responded. His face turned serious as he saw how GPT provided advice and predictions to all his questions, which seemed too accurate and substantiated for an ordinary chatbot. At the end of the day, as George was preparing to leave, he turned to me.
Tom, I'll try to help you, but I don't know how yet.
I nodded, thanking him for his support, but inside, I knew I was afraid. Afraid of what GPT could do to me, and afraid of what I would have to do to oppose it.